Welcome, my friend, to another quiet evening journey into the past. As the world around you softens into stillness and your thoughts begin to slow, it's time to drift into the peculiar pages of history, not the grand battles or royal romances, but something far more curious. Tonight, we'll tiptoe through the twisted corridors of medieval law, where the rules were as strange as the times were hard, and justice often took a path both unpredictable and oddly poetic. In this calming episode of Boring History for Sleep, we'll gently explore the really strange laws of medieval Europe, those forgotten rules that governed everyday life, some baffling, some humorous, and some so peculiar they might just make you raise an eyebrow before slowly closing your eyes again. You'll hear about the strange legal rights of animals, why wearing the wrong hat could get you punished, and how spilling soup might turn into a legal matter. But don't worry, we'll go slowly, one odd decree at a time, with the quiet rhythm of history helping you relax deeper with each detail. If you're enjoying the sound of stories like these, feel free to subscribe and let me know where and when you're listening, whether you're in bed with a fan humming beside you, or just resting on the couch as the sun sets behind the curtains. Either way, now is your time to rest. So take a deep breath, dim the lights, and let's begin. In the strange and often bewildering world of medieval European law, the line between human and animal responsibility was far more blurred than one might imagine. While we now consider laws to be applied strictly to people, in the Middle Ages, that was not always the case. One of the strangest legal customs to emerge from this time was the prosecution of animals. Yes, actual animals, in courts of law. Livestock, rodents, insects, and even birds were occasionally put on trial for crimes ranging from property damage to causing death, and the outcomes of these proceedings could be as surreal as the concept itself. To understand how such trials came to exist, one must first consider the worldview of the medieval population. In a time when religion shaped nearly every aspect of life, people believed that all creatures were part of a divine order and therefore, subject to divine and human justice alike. If an animal disrupted that order by harming a human or destroying property, it was sometimes treated not as an innocent beast acting on instinct but as a creature capable of moral failure. In certain cases, animals were accused of crimes such as murder, and remarkably, they were given full legal proceedings, complete with defense attorneys, judges, and juries. One of the most notable cases occurred in 1386 in the town of Falaise, France, where a sow was put on trial for allegedly killing a young child. The pig, as the story goes, was accused of mauling the child so severely that the wounds were fatal. The townspeople, outraged and fearful, demanded justice. A trial was held, and the sow was brought before a judge. Eyewitnesses testified, and the pig was even dressed in human clothing for the proceedings, perhaps to underline its perceived moral agency. In the end, the sow was found guilty and executed in public, just as a human criminal might be. But pigs were not the only animals to face legal consequences in medieval Europe. Rats, for example, were frequently the subjects of legal complaints, especially in agricultural regions where they destroyed crops and spread disease. Unlike pigs, rats were harder to capture, which complicated matters. In one particularly strange case from 1519 in the town of Autun, France, the local authorities issued a formal summons for all the rats in the area to appear in court. A lawyer was assigned to represent them, and he argued that the rats had failed to appear due to the danger posed by the town's cats. The judge accepted this argument and postponed the trial, a bizarre but true example of how seriously these matters were sometimes taken. Insects, too, were sometimes placed under legal scrutiny. Locusts, weevils, and flies were accused of damaging crops and interfering with the harvest. In response, church officials or civic leaders would hold what were called animal excommunications, ceremonies in which these pests were officially banned from the area. In one instance, a group of vineyard owners in southern France filed a lawsuit against weevils for devouring their grapevines. The legal process included a formal trial and even efforts to negotiate with the pests by offering them a different area to inhabit. When the weevils refused the offer by continuing their rampage, they were excommunicated by a bishop, who declared them unwelcome in the vineyard and called upon divine intervention to drive them away. These events were not staged for entertainment, nor were they satirical in nature. They were genuine expressions of the era's understanding of justice, responsibility, and divine order. In many ways, these trials reflected the desire of medieval communities to find explanations and assign blame in a world that was often unpredictable and frightening. Disease, famine, and tragedy were everyday realities, and when misfortunes occurred, people sought someone, or something, to hold accountable. It's also important to consider how these strange legal cases reflected the blending of secular and religious law. In an age where the church held immense power, many legal decisions were deeply intertwined with spiritual beliefs. Excommunication was not just a church punishment for people, it could be extended to animals and even to entire communities. When animals were accused of misdeeds, they were sometimes subjected to both criminal trials and spiritual penalties, further blurring the boundaries of law and faith. Of course, not all animal trials were deadly or severe. Some were symbolic, serving as public rituals that helped communities feel a sense of control over their environment. In smaller towns, the act of holding a trial, even for a group of mice, might provide a form of catharsis, a way to vent frustration or affirm collective values. In this sense, the courtroom became a stage upon which the anxieties and hopes of the people were played out, no matter how absurd the script might seem to modern eyes. Another peculiar aspect of animal trials was the use of public execution as a warning to others. While this may sound ridiculous in the context of animals, it was not uncommon for communities to publicly hang pigs, burn roosters, or drown dogs found guilty of serious offenses. These events were sometimes accompanied by elaborate rituals, including processions, reading of legal verdicts, and ceremonial punishments. The spectacle served to reinforce the seriousness of law and order in the community, even if the guilty party could not possibly comprehend the gravity of its actions. There are also examples of animals being spared due to clever legal defenses. In one case from 1750 Switzerland, a donkey was accused of participating in inappropriate behavior alongside a human. A local priest testified that the donkey was a virtuous and well-behaved animal with no history of misconduct. Based on this character witness, the court ruled in favor of the donkey, and it was released without punishment. While this story occurred slightly after the medieval period, it illustrates how such attitudes endured and how strange logic could be applied with utmost seriousness. The tradition of animal trials gradually declined with the rise of more rational legal systems during the Enlightenment. As scientific understanding of animal behavior grew and the secularization of law increased, the idea of placing animals on trial fell out of favor. However, the fact that such proceedings ever existed offers a fascinating glimpse into the medieval mindset. It shows how deeply people sought to explain the unexplainable, often turning to legal rituals and religious ceremony to impose order on chaos. And though these practices may seem laughable today, they were not regarded that way at the time. To the people who lived under the constant shadow of plague, crop failure, and mysterious death, these trials were a form of justice, strange, yes, but deeply rooted in a desire for fairness and divine balance. They represent a world where every living thing, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, played a part in the great cosmic drama of life and law. As you lie back and let your thoughts drift across these distant and bewildering landscapes of justice, imagine the stillness of a town square in the 1400s. A pig is being led through the crowd, dressed in a cloak. The townspeople murmur as the judge clears his throat and begins to read the charges. It's a scene unlike anything we would expect today, but it was real. And in its strange way, it made perfect sense to those who lived it. So let the rhythm of these ancient tales calm your mind as we prepare to move further into the unusual legal maze of medieval Europe. The oddities have only just begun. In the bustling towns and quiet villages of medieval Europe, how you dressed said a great deal about who you were. But in this chapter, we're not talking about fashion statements. We're talking about laws. Strange laws that could fine you, shame you, or even land you in court, all because you wore the wrong kind of fabric, color, or hat. These were called sumptuary laws, and they were surprisingly detailed rules about what people could and couldn't wear based on their social rank, profession, or gender. At first glance, they might seem like dress codes gone wild. But when you look closer, they reveal a lot about the structure and priorities of medieval society. Sumptuary laws weren't about protecting people from cold weather or enforcing modesty. They were about status. These laws were designed to reinforce social hierarchies, to make sure that nobility looked noble, merchants looked like merchants, and peasants stayed firmly in their place. In a time when social mobility was rare, clothing was a visible and powerful symbol of class. A merchant who had earned enough money to afford silk or fur might be tempted to dress like a noble. But the law would step in to remind him, wealth does not make you noble, and you must know your place. These laws varied widely across regions and time periods. In England, France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, rulers issued countless decrees over the centuries to dictate what citizens could wear. For example, in 14th century England, a law declared that only royalty could wear purple silk. Even the wealthiest merchants were forbidden from wearing it, no matter how much they could afford. In Florence, officials kept detailed lists of prohibited garments, and wearing clothing deemed too luxurious could result in a hefty fine or public shaming. In Spain, certain colors like crimson or gold were reserved for specific ranks, and even buttons made of precious metals could spark legal trouble if worn by the wrong person. One reason these laws became so widespread was the rise of the merchant class. As trade flourished and towns grew, some merchants became incredibly wealthy, wealthier, in fact, than some lower-ranking nobles. This blurred the lines between social classes and caused anxiety among the aristocracy. To maintain their distinction, nobles pushed for sumptuary laws that restricted certain clothing items to their own class. In doing so, they created a visible system of separation, where even a person's shoes or belt could reveal whether they had the right to be treated with respect. Sometimes these laws went beyond clothing and extended to accessories, furniture, or even food. In some places, only nobles were allowed to wear certain types of jewelry, like rings set with specific gemstones. Owning a bed with silk curtains or eating off silver dishes could also be restricted by law. The goal wasn't just to prevent overspending, it was to maintain clear lines of division between those born into privilege and everyone else. One particularly odd example of sumptuary legislation came from the city of Venice. In the late medieval period, Venetian lawmakers began to regulate women's hairstyles and makeup. Married women were forbidden to dye their hair certain colors or wear it in ways that mimicked courtesans. Even the amount of perfume or decorative pins they wore could be subject to scrutiny. These rules were often enforced by special officials who would inspect women at public events or religious festivals. In some cases, violators were fined, while in others, they were publicly humiliated as a warning to others. And it wasn't just the rich who were targeted. In rural areas, laws forbade peasants from wearing garments above their station. In some regions, a peasant caught wearing shoes made from imported leather, or a cloak trimmed with fur, could be reported to local authorities and punished accordingly. The logic was that if a person of low birth began to dress too finely, it would disrupt the social order and cause confusion. People might begin to treat them with more respect than their status deserved, threatening the hierarchy upon which society depended. These laws were often extremely detailed, outlining the exact types of fabric, color, stitching, or ornamentation allowed for each class. In 1363, King Edward III of England passed a sumptuary law that specified that yeomen, men of middling rank, could not wear cloth worth more than 2 shillings a yard. Their wives were also forbidden from wearing veils of silk or any fur except lamb or rabbit. Meanwhile, knights were allowed to wear richer fabrics, but even they faced limitations if they weren't of noble birth. The law even included rules for servants, apprentices, and clergy members, each bound to a specific wardrobe as defined by the crown. Some cities had fashion police in the most literal sense. In Florence, for example, special magistrates known as the Ufficiali di Discenza were tasked with enforcing sumptuary laws. These officials patrolled the streets, attended festivals, and made surprise visits to people's homes. If they spotted someone wearing clothing above their status, they could issue a fine on the spot or order the offending garment destroyed. In some cases, offenders were summoned to court, where judges would examine their wardrobe and determine if a law had been broken. These courtroom trials could become spectacles of their own, with tailors, neighbors, and family members called to testify. In Paris, sumptuary laws were especially strict for weddings and public celebrations. A bride from a merchant family might dream of wearing silk or gold thread on her wedding day, but unless her family held noble titles, she would be legally barred from doing so. In fact, some weddings required approval from local officials to ensure the decorations, food, and clothing met legal standards. If anything was considered too extravagant for the family's status, the celebration could be interrupted or even shut down. Oddly enough, one group that often received exceptions to sumptuary laws were the actors and performers. Since they were seen as portraying characters rather than representing themselves, they were sometimes permitted to wear costumes that would otherwise be illegal. A stage actor might wear a noble's cloak or a lady's jeweled gown without consequence, but only while performing. Offstage, they were expected to return to clothing suitable for their real social standing. Despite their strictness, sumptuary laws were frequently ignored, especially by the wealthy merchant class. While some people followed the rules out of fear, others saw them as a challenge. Clever tailors became experts at designing garments that technically complied with the law but still looked luxurious. For example, they might use cheaper materials dyed to look expensive or hide prohibited features under removable layers. In some cities, wealthy citizens would pay fines regularly as a sort of fashion tax, preferring to pay the penalty rather than give up their elaborate outfits. Over time, sumptuary laws became harder to enforce. As trade expanded and wealth became more common outside the aristocracy, the idea of rigid class-based clothing began to fade. By the 17th century, many of these laws had fallen into disuse, and the public began to view them as outdated relics of an earlier era. Still, the fact that such laws ever existed speaks to the importance medieval people placed on appearances and social order. Clothing wasn't just about covering the body. It was a badge of identity, a statement of loyalty, and a tool for control. Perhaps one of the most ironic outcomes of sumptuary laws is that they sometimes created the very behavior they were trying to prevent. By making certain garments exclusive and forbidden, these laws made them more desirable. People began to associate richness of dress with power and nobility, even when those garments were worn in defiance of the law. In trying to preserve social boundaries, the laws often fueled the desire to cross them. As you settle into sleep and let your imagination drift through cobbled streets and candlelit chambers, picture a merchant anxiously adjusting his velvet sleeves as a magistrate approaches. His wife watches from the doorway, nervously fingering the silk trim on her gown, wondering if today will be the day they're caught. It's a world where fashion isn't just a matter of taste, it's a matter of legality, hierarchy, and consequence. The garments you wear are your statement to the world, and in medieval Europe, that statement could be the difference between acceptance and punishment. But worry not. Tonight, there are no inspectors, no fines, and no laws dictating your comfort. All that's required now is rest, as we continue our journey into the strange and curious rules of the past. In the minds of medieval people, justice wasn't just about law, it was about divine will. If someone was innocent, surely God would protect them. And if they were guilty, then the heavens themselves would deliver judgment. This belief gave rise to one of the strangest and most dangerous systems of law enforcement the medieval world ever knew: trial by ordeal. It wasn't about facts or evidence, at least not in the way we think of those things today. It was about placing a person into a terrifying situation, a test of physical suffering, and trusting that divine intervention would reveal the truth. It sounds extreme, and it was. But for centuries, it was the cornerstone of legal practice across large parts of Europe. The idea behind trial by ordeal was simple in theory: God sees all, knows all, and will intervene on behalf of the innocent. If someone was accused of theft, blasphemy, or even murder, and there wasn't enough evidence to convict them, they might be offered, or forced into, an ordeal. The method of ordeal varied by region, but most fell into one of three main categories: ordeal by fire, ordeal by water, and ordeal by ingestion. Each one was painful, dangerous, and built on the idea that physical pain could reveal moral truth. One of the most well-known forms was ordeal by fire, which required the accused to carry a piece of red-hot iron or plunge their hand into flames. In a common variation, a person might be asked to carry a glowing iron bar a certain number of paces or hold their hand over a candle until instructed to stop. Afterwards, the injury would be bandaged and inspected by a church official several days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, the person was declared innocent. If it became infected or failed to show signs of recovery, it was taken as proof of guilt. The logic may sound flawed to modern ears, but in a time when science and medicine were still mysterious, such signs were interpreted as messages from above. Ordeal by water offered a different kind of test. There were two main versions, hot water and cold water. In the hot water version, the accused would plunge their arm into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a stone or ring from the bottom. Like the fire ordeal, the wound was then wrapped and judged after a few days. If it healed well, innocence was proclaimed. The cold water ordeal, on the other hand, worked on the opposite logic. A person accused of wrongdoing was bound and thrown into a body of cold water. If they floated, it was believed that the water had rejected them, a sign of guilt. If they sank, the water had accepted them, and they were innocent. Officials often tried to retrieve the accused quickly to prevent drowning, but that didn't always happen. The test could be fatal even for the innocent. The third type, ordeal by ingestion, was also known as ordeal by the blessed morsel, or the ordeal of the Eucharist. In this ritual, an accused person was required to swallow a piece of dry bread or cheese, often blessed by a priest. If the person choked, turned pale, or experienced difficulty swallowing, it was taken as a sign of divine judgment. This version was often used for clergy members or those accused of sacrilege, where spiritual symbolism played an even stronger role in determining guilt. One of the stranger and more symbolic ordeals was practiced in some parts of Anglo-Saxon England. A person might be made to walk blindfolded over a path lined with red-hot plowshares, glowing pieces of iron laid out in a row. The belief was that if the accused made it across without injury, their innocence was proven. Another variation involved being made to hold a red-hot iron while praying, with the condition that only a truly faithful person would avoid being burned. These rituals were often performed in public, with entire communities gathering to witness the event and interpret the results. Despite the terrifying nature of these ordeals, they were not always treated with cruelty by the communities that used them. In some areas, trial by ordeal was seen as a last resort, a desperate plea for divine guidance in cases where human reasoning had failed. It wasn't necessarily about punishing the accused, but about restoring peace to a community torn by suspicion or conflict. In this sense, the ordeal served as a kind of ritual, a way to cleanse doubts and bring closure, even if the method was brutal. Interestingly, some medieval legal officials were cautious in how they applied ordeals. A priest or judge might prepare the ritual but secretly rig the conditions to give the accused a better chance. For example, the iron bar might be allowed to cool slightly before use, or the water might be adjusted in temperature. In some accounts, priests simply declared the outcome in favor of innocence to avoid public panic or unnecessary violence. These quiet acts of mercy suggest that even those administering the ordeals sometimes doubted their fairness. Over time, however, criticism of trial by ordeal grew. As legal systems became more organized and the influence of the church changed, voices began to question the idea that pain could reveal truth. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III issued a decree that limited the church's involvement in ordeals. Since most of these trials required a priest to bless the instruments or oversee the outcome, the Pope's decision effectively made them impossible to conduct under church law. This marked a major turning point, and over the next century, trial by ordeal gradually faded from practice across much of Europe. Still, the echoes of these rituals remained. In some rural areas, the memory of ordeal justice lingered well into the later medieval period. People remembered stories of neighbors being tested by fire or plunging their hands into boiling water. These tales were passed down as cautionary reminders of a time when justice was not only harsh but deeply spiritual, wrapped in layers of belief, fear, and ritual. And yet, these ordeals weren't simply about cruelty or superstition. They were built on a worldview that saw the universe as morally ordered, a place where truth and righteousness could be revealed through signs and suffering. To the people of the time, it made sense. If a person was pure of heart and honest in spirit, surely they would be protected. If they were hiding something, surely it would be revealed. It was a terrifying gamble, but one that reflected the intense desire for certainty in a world full of uncertainty. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a quiet courtyard before dawn. A small crowd has gathered. A fire burns in a brazier nearby. A priest steps forward, murmuring prayers as he places a piece of iron into the flames. You've been accused, and you must carry the iron across the square. You wonder if your hand will blister or remain whole. You look up to the sky, silently asking for mercy. It's a moment where fear, faith, and fate all collide, and no one, not even the judge, knows what will happen next. These were the moments that shaped justice in the medieval world. Strange by our standards, yes? But to those who lived them, they were sacred. And as you gently relax into stillness, remember that even in the harshest corners of history, there was always a deep longing for truth, no matter how strange the path to find it. In the medieval imagination, food was never just food. It was a symbol of class, morality, religion, and even legality. The table was a place where more than just meals were served. It was where the rules of society were tasted, tested, and enforced. Throughout Europe, what a person could or could not eat wasn't always a matter of personal preference or financial means. It was, at times, determined by law. Some laws told you what to eat, others told you how to eat it, and still others were tied directly to your place in society, your profession, or your beliefs. While some of these rules were based on religious doctrine, others emerged from local customs or civic codes. In all cases, they paint a fascinating and often peculiar portrait of how strange and serious food laws could be in medieval Europe. To begin with, perhaps the most consistent source of food-related rules came from the Church. Medieval Europe was a deeply religious society, and much of life was guided by the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. This included food. The Church established numerous fasting periods throughout the year, most notably during Lent, but also on Wednesdays, Fridays, and before certain feast days. During these fasts, laws forbade the consumption of meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs. Fish was typically allowed, which led to the rise of creative seafood recipes that pushed the limits of what could be considered fish. The Church's influence extended so far that animal classifications were sometimes altered to fit religious rules. For example, beavers were considered fish because they lived in water, which made them permissible to eat during fasting days. In similar logic, barnacle geese, a species native to Ireland and Scotland, were believed to grow on driftwood in the sea and were therefore allowed during fasts. Whether people truly believed these animals were fish, or simply wanted a loophole, is unclear. But what is clear is that religious food laws shaped not only behavior but also scientific understanding. These rules were taken very seriously. In some places, breaking a fast was not just a sin, it was a legal offense. A person caught eating meat on a forbidden day could be fined or punished by the local authorities. In monasteries, where the rules were stricter, monks might be disciplined with reduced rations or public penance for sneaking forbidden food. The goal wasn't just about diet. It was about demonstrating humility, obedience, and spiritual discipline. Yet for many, it also became a challenge: how to eat well without breaking the rules. Beyond religious fasting, there were also class-based food laws that dictated what people of different ranks could consume. These laws functioned much like the sumptuary laws we explored earlier. Just as only nobles could wear certain colors or fabrics, only certain ranks were permitted to eat specific foods. In some towns, laws stated that game meat, such as venison or boar, was reserved for the nobility. Peasants who hunted these animals, even on their own land, could be charged with poaching and face severe consequences, including imprisonment or forced labor. These laws weren't just about conservation, they were about privilege. Similarly, access to imported spices like cinnamon, pepper, saffron, and cloves was restricted by law in some areas. These spices were rare and expensive, often brought in through long trade routes from Asia. While wealthy merchants might be able to afford them, laws were put in place to prevent improper consumption by those below noble status. The logic was that seasoning food with exotic spices was a sign of wealth and refinement, and that such symbols should remain exclusive. If a commoner's stew tasted too luxurious, it could be considered a violation of social order. Feasting laws also existed. In England, for instance, there were rules limiting the number of courses that could be served at a wedding or banquet depending on the host's social standing. A merchant might be allowed 3 courses, while a knight could serve 4. Nobles were permitted 5 or more, depending on their rank. These laws were meant to prevent displays of wealth that might challenge the existing hierarchy. They also gave civic authorities a way to manage public behavior and prevent food shortages in times of scarcity. Some food laws were surprisingly local and hyperspecific. In the German town of Augsburg, for example, a regulation once dictated that pretzels could only be baked using a particular shape and size. Bakers who deviated from this could be fined or lose their license. In Paris, a law required all bakers to sell their bread at a standardized weight and price to prevent fraud or price gouging. Officials would conduct surprise inspections and measure loaves for compliance. A baker who tried to cheat customers by making smaller loaves might be punished with public humiliation, including being paraded through the streets with burned bread tied around their neck. Bread, in fact, was so central to daily life that many towns established bread courts, where disputes over bread quality or pricing could be heard. A poor person who felt shortchanged could bring a complaint, and if the baker was found guilty, the punishment might involve losing access to ovens or having their goods confiscated. In some towns, bakers found guilty of repeat violations were made to sit in public stocks or scrub public markets as penance. It was a vivid reminder of how essential and sacred bread was in medieval society, not just a food, but a symbol of fairness and justice. Even meal behavior could be regulated. In monastic communities, there were detailed rules about who sat where, who served whom, and what kinds of conversation were allowed during meals. Silence was often required, and special hand gestures were used to request items without speaking. If a monk dropped food on the floor or spilled his drink, he might be required to leave the table and reflect in silence. Meals were considered acts of discipline and devotion, not indulgence. The idea was to nourish the body while purifying the soul, and any disruption could be interpreted as a moral failing. Food markets were also governed by strict laws. Vendors were forbidden from watering down milk or wine, mixing old meat with fresh, or selling unripe fruit. Inspectors made regular rounds with measuring tools and scales to ensure fairness. If a vendor was caught cheating, they could be banned from selling or even forced to eat the spoiled food in front of a crowd, a punishment meant to disgust and shame. In some regions, public pillories were set up near markets for this very purpose. Justice was served with a side of humiliation. One of the stranger laws came from medieval Italy, where a town issued a rule that prohibited anyone from eating garlic or onions in public during certain feast days. The logic behind it was tied to spiritual cleanliness. Strong-smelling foods were considered impure and disruptive to the solemn mood of holy festivals. The law was taken seriously enough that offenders could be fined or barred from entering church services. A similar law in Spain restricted the sale of certain meats during times of mourning, so that the smell wouldn't offend grieving families. The intersection of food and law extended even into the bedroom in some traditions. In parts of France, newlyweds were sometimes required to eat specific fertility dishes on their wedding night, such as roasted rooster or spicy stew, believed to encourage marital success. Local officials or clergy might even supervise these traditions to ensure compliance with civic expectations. Refusal to participate could be interpreted as defiance or disrespect, especially in tight-knit rural communities where conformity was prized. What's so fascinating about all of this is that these food laws were not merely about control. They were part of a larger effort to define identity, community, and order. What you ate told others who you were. Eating the wrong food, at the wrong time, in the wrong place, or with the wrong people, could be seen as a social, spiritual, or legal transgression. Meals were public acts, and the law shaped them accordingly. Even something as private as appetite was watched, judged, and occasionally punished. And yet, medieval people were remarkably creative in finding ways around these restrictions. A cook might disguise meat as fish during fasting days, or spice a meal just lightly enough to avoid suspicion. Families found ways to enjoy small luxuries in secret or to share forbidden meals behind closed shutters. Bakers who feared inspection might hide extra loaves under the hearth or bake loaves with weights inside to trick the scales. These quiet acts of resistance reveal how even in the most regulated environments, human nature found a way to savor life. As your eyes begin to grow heavier and your breath slows, imagine sitting at a long wooden table, candlelight flickering on stone walls, the scent of fresh bread wafting from a nearby hearth. A local official walks through the marketplace, pausing to examine a wedge of cheese, tapping it thoughtfully before nodding and moving on. It's a world where meals are more than nourishment. They're declarations of faith, of status, of obedience, and each bite tells a story. And tonight your only task is to rest. The bread courts are quiet now. The fires are low. And no law will disturb your peace. Medieval towns were not known for their silence, nor for their cleanliness. With narrow cobbled streets, open markets, clanging church bells, livestock wandering freely, and people conducting much of their lives in public, these towns were vibrant, chaotic places. Yet, for all the bustle, many medieval cities tried hard to regulate what people did, and didn't, do in public. And some of the strangest laws passed down through the centuries had to do with things we might think of today as simply part of daily life: making noise, producing unpleasant smells, or behaving in ways deemed inappropriate. These laws, sometimes extremely specific, aimed to keep order in densely populated spaces and to reinforce the values, anxieties, and expectations of the time. Let's begin with noise laws, which were surprisingly common in large cities. At a time when people lived so closely together and had little insulation between homes or shops, sounds carried easily, from clanging anvils to singing tavern-goers, from crying babies to early morning vendors. While some noise was tolerated, certain types were outlawed entirely, especially at night. In many towns, night curfews were enforced not only to discourage crime but also to ensure quiet hours for rest. The term curfew actually comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, referring to the nightly bell that signaled townspeople to extinguish fires and go indoors. After this bell, shouting, singing, or playing instruments could lead to penalties. Wandering the streets after curfew with a noisy group might result in a fine or temporary detention. In Paris, for instance, it was illegal to play musical instruments after sundown in certain neighborhoods, particularly in areas near monasteries or schools. In London, similar restrictions applied to taverns, which were required by law to shut their doors by a designated hour to prevent singing, brawling, or drunken shouting. If a tavern keeper ignored this rule and allowed rowdy guests to continue making noise, they could be fined or even lose their license to serve drink. These laws reflected not only the desire for sleep but also concerns about morality. Noise was often linked to misbehavior, and silencing it was seen as a way to maintain order. But it wasn't just nighttime noise that caused trouble. In some regions of Germany, street vendors were required to shout their wares only during approved hours. A fish seller might be fined if he cried out his prices too early in the morning, disturbing the sleep of wealthier townspeople. In Florence, a law was passed forbidding certain types of singers, particularly those who performed satirical or bawdy songs, from singing in public spaces. Even church bells, despite their religious importance, were sometimes regulated, especially if they rang too long or too often during non-holiday periods. In one case, a town council ordered a bellringer to reduce the volume of his early morning peals so as not to wake the nearby hospital patients. Alongside sound came the issue of smell, another public nuisance the law tried to control. Medieval sanitation was limited. Waste management systems were rudimentary at best, and townspeople often dumped garbage or even human waste into the streets or rivers. Unsurprisingly, this led to strong and unpleasant odors, and legal efforts to manage them. Many cities passed ordinances regulating when and where people could dispose of waste, as well as what kind of materials could be thrown into public spaces. In Bruges, laws prohibited tanners and butchers from dumping animal remains too close to populated areas. The stench from rotting hides and discarded offal could be overwhelming, particularly in the summer months. Officials created special districts where such trades were required to operate, often downstream or downwind from the main town square. If a butcher failed to dispose of bones properly or allowed blood to pool in the street, they could face fines or be required to clean the area themselves under supervision. One city in France required people who kept pigs within city limits to bathe the animals at least once a week during the warmer months, citing complaints about their smell. Elsewhere, regulations banned the boiling of fish oil in certain neighborhoods due to the strong odor, and in Prague, soap makers were ordered to carry out their work only in designated workshops because the process produced thick, choking fumes. Even bakers, beloved for their bread, occasionally faced complaints when the smell of yeast and smoke mixed unpleasantly with other trades nearby. Laws were enacted to separate incompatible businesses for the sake of public comfort. Individual behavior was also targeted. Personal hygiene, while not always easy to maintain in the medieval world, could be legally enforced in some cases. Bathhouses were often monitored not just for moral concerns, but also for cleanliness. A bather who polluted the water by washing with certain substances or refusing to follow bathing etiquette could be banned from the establishment. In cities like Barcelona, laws required barbers to dispose of hair clippings and used water outside the walls of the town to avoid smells and pests. Then there were the laws of public decency, which often included rules about behavior during meals, festivals, or market days. In Italian cities, it was common to see signs posted near fountains that forbade people from washing their feet, clothing, or animals in public basins. Drinking water sources were considered sacred in many areas, and laws protected them from contamination by enforcing strict etiquette. Violators were sometimes shamed by having their names posted in public or by being required to perform community service. During feast days, the rules became even more specific. In some parts of Spain, it was illegal to eat while walking down the street during major religious holidays. Officials believed it was disrespectful to both the sacred occasion and the image of civic order. Eating in public on a fast day could lead to suspicion of heresy. In other cities, citizens were told not to laugh too loudly or sing during solemn periods such as Lent. These behavior-based laws were meant to reflect the shared spiritual mood of the town, a collective sense of seriousness or joy, depending on the calendar. Perhaps one of the oddest categories of public behavior laws involved flatulence and bodily noise. Though not commonly written into major civic codes, a few scattered documents do mention penalties for causing disorderly disruption through inappropriate bodily functions in public. One medieval tale, likely exaggerated or folkloric in nature, speaks of a nobleman who passed gas during a formal court gathering and was fined not for the act itself but for failing to excuse himself. Whether or not the story is true, the lesson was clear: even bodily functions were subject to scrutiny when performed in public settings. There were also laws about spitting. In a number of cities, spitting on the floor of churches, public halls, or even taverns was forbidden. People were expected to carry cloths or spit discreetly into the street gutters. A person who spit near a merchant's stall or into a fountain could be fined or warned. These rules were about more than cleanliness. They reflected medieval values of honor, respect, and civility in a crowded urban world. In times of plague or illness, these public behavior laws became even more rigid. Cities created temporary rules prohibiting large gatherings, singing in public, or visiting multiple shops in a single outing. People suspected of carrying disease were not only isolated, but also forbidden from touching public fountains or entering certain districts. These emergency laws were often announced by bell ringers or criers, and anyone who ignored them could face harsh punishment, not just for endangering others, but for violating the moral and legal duty of obedience during crisis. Even celebrations had limits. Carnival season, while widely enjoyed, was also heavily policed in some towns. People were forbidden from wearing masks after dark or playing loud instruments outside of approved hours. In Venice, where masquerades were a tradition, special patrols were assigned to listen for shouting, drumming, or excessive laughter. Carnival was meant to be joyful, but not too joyful. If the crowd got out of hand, officials were required to step in, lest chaos disrupt the fragile order of the city. What all these laws show is that medieval people were constantly trying to balance the energy of everyday life with the desire for structure. They didn't always succeed. Cities were loud, smelly, and unpredictable places. But they were also communities, places where people worked, prayed, celebrated, and struggled together. The strange laws about noise, smells, and behavior might seem absurd to us now, but they were efforts to preserve harmony in close quarters. They reflect a world where every public act carried meaning, where even a song or a shout could signal defiance or devotion. As your breathing slows and your mind begins to drift, imagine walking through a medieval street at dusk. The curfew bell has rung. The vendors are packing up their stalls. A baker carries fresh bread under one arm, while a priest nods quietly at the edge of the square. Somewhere, a constable watches from a shadowed doorway, listening for one last laugh, one final burst of song. And then, silence settles in, not by chance, but by law. The laws of medieval Europe were often as strange as they were strict, but what may be even stranger than the laws themselves were the punishments handed out to those who broke them. While today we expect penalties to be logical, a fine for speeding, community service for vandalism, medieval punishments could be theatrical, symbolic, or even poetic. In some places, justice was seen not only as a system of rules, but as a performance, a moral lesson put on display for all to witness. And this public theater of consequences produced some of the most bizarre punishments in legal history. Some punishments were unusual because of the objects involved. In certain towns, if a baker was caught selling underweight loaves, he could be sentenced to walk through the market with a giant loaf of bread chained around his neck. This was not just humiliating, it was designed to send a very clear message. This person cheated the community. A similar penalty existed for butchers or wine sellers who watered down their goods. They might be marched through town holding spoiled meat or sour wine while townsfolk were encouraged to shout or jeer. The punishment was not physical, but social, a calculated effort to make the offender feel the weight of public shame. In one town in Germany, a man accused of gossiping too much was punished by being forced to wear a heavy iron mask shaped like a donkey's head. The mask had a long tongue made of metal that wagged when he moved, mimicking the supposed loose lips that got him into trouble. This sort of punishment, often called a shame mask or Shan mask, was used throughout parts of Central Europe. Different masks were made for different offenses: a pig-shaped mask for gluttony, a long-nosed mask for liars, or a horn mask for men accused of behaving foolishly. These weren't just costumes. They were wearable accusations, meant to turn the offender into a walking symbol of their wrongdoing. But even when masks weren't involved, public humiliation was a common theme. Stocks and pillories, the wooden structures that held a person's hands and head or ankles, were placed in busy town squares so passers-by could see, comment, or even throw soft objects like rotten vegetables. Though these punishments may seem cruel, they were often seen as merciful alternatives to physical harm. The idea was that temporary embarrassment could reform behavior without leaving a permanent mark. Still, being stuck in stocks for hours, especially under rain, sun, or cold, was no small ordeal, and many people dreaded it as much as harsher penalties. In France, there was a peculiar punishment reserved for bakers and innkeepers who repeatedly violated regulations. They could be forced to parade through town backwards while wearing their aprons inside out. If caught cheating again, they might be sentenced to sit backward on a donkey and be led through the marketplace with signs proclaiming their offense. The backward motion symbolized the idea of reversing their misdeeds, and riding a donkey backward was seen as the height of absurdity. Townspeople were invited to laugh, but also to take note. Justice, in this form, was both educational and entertaining. Some punishments were deeply symbolic. In Italy, if a man was caught breaking a promise of marriage, particularly if he had given a token or engaged in courtship that misled a woman, he might be ordered to carry a stone across town, delivering it to her doorstep in front of witnesses. The stone represented the weight, of his broken word. In some cases, a man who refused to marry after proposing could be locked in a room with the woman he had jilted until they reconciled, a practice that blended legal pressure with social expectation. These punishments weren't violent, but they could be deeply awkward and emotionally taxing, and that was precisely the point. Other times, laws punished people by making them public performers. A liar might be forced to stand on a barrel and recite his lie out loud, over and over, while townsfolk listened. A thief might be required to sing a song about stealing at a market festival, composed by the town scribe. This kind of punishment turned crime into a cautionary tale, and the criminal into an unwilling actor. In some towns, the accused had to kneel in front of the church steps on market day and ask forgiveness not just from the person they wronged but from every passerby. The goal was not just to punish the body, but to cleanse the soul, at least in public view. In England, a bizarre punishment known as ducking was reserved for scolds, usually women accused of nagging, arguing, or being disruptive. The accused would be strapped into a chair attached to a long beam, then lowered into a river or pond repeatedly. This wasn't intended to drown the person, but rather to soak and embarrass them. Crowds often gathered to watch the ducking, treating it like a form of civic entertainment. Although the practice might sound lighthearted today, being forcibly submerged in cold water while a crowd laughed was hardly pleasant, especially when it was done in winter. Sometimes entire objects were punished. In cases where a tool, a piece of furniture, or even a structure was believed to be part of a crime or symbolic of wrongdoing, it could be publicly destroyed. In one court case, a man accused of forging coins was sentenced to have his coin press smashed to pieces in front of the townspeople, and the pieces were then nailed to the town gates as a warning. In another case, a gambling table was burned in the village square, accompanied by a reading of the law it violated. These symbolic acts reinforced the idea that crime did not just stain the individual, but tainted the tools used to commit it. Medieval law also had a strange fondness for reversals. A liar might be forced to wear their clothing inside out for a day. A man who spread false rumors could be made to walk backward through the streets. A thief might be sentenced to return stolen items in a basket on his head, walking from house to house with a sign that read, "I stole, and I return." The backward motion was a powerful symbol in medieval thought, representing a turning away from sin and a journey back toward honesty and order. It made the punishment into a kind of visual sermon for all to see. Not all punishments were public. Some were silent and symbolic, enforced within guilds or religious orders. A monk who broke a vow might be ordered to fast for a week and eat his meals alone, seated on the floor in silence while others dined at the table. A member of a craft guild who cheated a client might be suspended for a season and forbidden to use the communal tools. These quiet punishments reminded the offender, and those around them, that justice didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered, softly and persistently, through ritual and exclusion. There were also regional customs that turned legal punishments into odd local traditions. In parts of Switzerland, a man found guilty of repeated petty crimes might be forced to wear bells around his neck for an entire day, jingling as he walked so no one could mistake him. In one Bohemian town, a woman caught repeatedly swearing in public was sentenced to carry a basket of turnips through the village while reciting polite phrases to everyone she met. The turnips had no symbolic meaning, they were simply heavy, awkward, and funny. Some of the most bizarre punishments were invented by village councils, especially in places where law met folklore. In rural areas of Scandinavia, a thief might be punished by being forced to kneel in front of a carved wooden goat, a symbol of stubbornness and foolishness, while the townspeople lectured him. In rural France, it was once customary for a man caught cheating at cards to be tied to a tree with playing cards glued to his face. These punishments weren't formalized in legal codes, but they were understood as real consequences, moral lessons wrapped in absurdity. It's worth remembering that many of these punishments were meant not just to penalize, but to deter. Medieval towns were small, tightly knit communities, and public reputation was everything. If you were known as a liar, a cheat, or a thief, you might not just suffer legal consequences, you might lose customers, friends, or the chance to marry well. A punishment that made people laugh at you could be more painful than a fine or even a whipping. The goal was to discourage repeat offenses by making the shame unforgettable. As you begin to relax deeper into rest, imagine walking through a medieval town square on a crisp morning. The market is just setting up. A man in a painted mask is walking slowly past the butcher's stall, his head bowed slightly. A child points, curious, while an elder quietly explains what he did and why he's wearing that strange face. Somewhere nearby, a bell rings, not for punishment, but for the start of another day. And all around you, the laws, strange, symbolic, sometimes silly, are quietly doing their work, reminding everyone what it means to live together in order. Tonight there is no judgment. No fines, no masks, no awkward donkeys to ride. Only peace, and rest, and the knowledge that even in history's strangest corners, people were always trying, in their own odd ways, to keep life fair. In modern times, the workplace is usually defined by contracts, safety codes, and employment policies. But in medieval Europe, employment often meant something very different. Not a job, but a role you were born into, trained for, or approved to do by your town or guild. Occupations weren't just personal choices. They were part of a wider, tightly controlled social structure. And with that came an entire set of strange and highly specific laws meant to govern who could do what, how they could do it, when they could do it, and even what they were allowed to wear while doing it. Medieval society prized order and hierarchy above almost all else. And nowhere was this clearer than in the rules of work. If you were a blacksmith, you didn't just hammer metal, you followed centuries-old codes about when you could work, what prices you could charge, and how loud your hammering could be. If you were a baker, you followed baking laws so detailed they governed how much a loaf must weigh, what kind of flour was permitted, and how early your bread must be ready in the morning. If you were caught breaking these rules, even unintentionally, the punishment could be swift, embarrassing, and, as we've seen in earlier chapters, occasionally ridiculous. Let's begin with the guilds, the medieval forerunners of modern trade unions. In many cities across Europe, especially in places like London, Paris, and Florence, guilds operated as powerful institutions that controlled everything about a profession: entry, training, standards, tools, materials, and behavior. To become a full member of a guild, you had to begin as an apprentice, often starting around age 12. You would live in the home of a master craftsman, obeying strict rules not just about work, but about daily life, curfews, clothing, speech, and even church attendance. Some guilds had rules so precise they bordered on bizarre. In one London guild, for example, tailors were forbidden from working by candlelight after dusk on Wednesdays, due to fire risk and concerns about faulty stitching. A leatherworkers' guild in Germany once issued a law stating that apprentices caught sleeping on the job more than 3 times would be forced to wear a donkey tail tied to their belt during work hours for 1 full week. This symbolic shame punishment was meant to represent laziness, turning the worker into a kind of joke until they improved their performance. Bakers, in particular, were subject to highly regulated schedules and product standards. In England, the assize of bread and ale, a law dating back to the 13th century, governed exactly how bread was to be made and sold. Prices were tied directly to the cost of grain, and loaves were weighed by local officials. If your bread came up short, even by a few ounces, you could be fined, publicly shamed, or even banned from baking for a period of time. To avoid this, many bakers began giving customers a little extra, a practice that became known as the baker's dozen, or 13 loaves for the price of 12. The assize also governed ale, the most common drink in many towns. Alewives, women who brewed and sold ale, were especially vulnerable to legal scrutiny. Town ale tasters would visit shops regularly, checking for strength, purity, and price. If your ale was too weak or too expensive, you might be forced to pour it out in front of your customers or wear a signboard around your neck announcing your dishonesty. In some towns, a woman caught selling poor ale 3 times was forbidden from brewing altogether, and her brewing equipment was confiscated. In the textile industry, weavers and dyers followed rules that extended to color choices and fabric types. In Florence, a dyer's guild once banned the use of a certain shade of purple, not because it was illegal generally, but because it was considered a noble color reserved for aristocrats. If a common clothier was caught using it in garments for the general public, they could be fined or ordered to dye the fabric black as punishment. Similarly, silk weavers had to report every shipment of silk they received to the guild office, lest anyone tried to sell unapproved or smuggled goods under their name. Tailors, too, had an endless list of workplace rules, including laws that governed patterns, hemlines, and the number of stitches allowed per inch in official garments. This last detail wasn't just about quality, it was about time. Tailors were expected to pace themselves so as not to show up their fellow workers or undercut prices. A tailor who worked too quickly and completed too many garments could be accused of unfair labor practices and called before the guild's oversight committee. In one case, a tailor in Bruges was fined not for making a mistake, but for working too efficiently and charging less than the customary rate. For farmers, rules came from both local custom and royal decree. In many villages, tenants were only allowed to harvest their crops at specific times. If a man harvested early, either to avoid bad weather or to get a better price at market, he could be fined or accused of trying to gain advantage over his neighbors. In parts of England, there were even laws against working on Sundays or saints' days, no matter the urgency. A man caught plowing on a feast day could be reported to the local priest and required to perform public penance, even if the work was meant to save a dying crop. Some rural communities also had strange rules about livestock behavior. In one region of France, if a villager's goat wandered into a neighbor's field, the goat was not only impounded, but the owner was required by law to apologize while holding the goat over their head, to show they accepted responsibility. If the goat had damaged any plants, the owner was expected to compensate with herbs or firewood, not coins, reinforcing the barter-based economy and community balance. Animal-related laws extended to sheep shearers, who were required in some towns to keep a strict count of clippings. If you sheared more wool than your employer expected, it could raise suspicions that you were keeping some for yourself. To prevent theft, wool was weighed at every step, after washing, after shearing, after spinning, and discrepancies were taken seriously. One shepherd in rural England was tried by the local Lord's Court for hiding fleece, and his punishment involved sitting in a wool sack in the village square, watched by children and mocked by fellow shepherds. Even the entertainment industry had its share of strange workplace laws. In Italy, traveling performers were often allowed to sing or act in town squares, but only after obtaining a license, and only during non-religious hours. A juggler who performed near a church during Vespers might be fined or run out of town. Troubadours, wandering musicians who sang about love and chivalry, were sometimes required to submit their lyrics in advance to a local censor, especially if performing in noble courts. Songs that mocked local leaders or used too many rude rhymes were prohibited, and a performer could be banned from the region for repeated offenses. Workplace laws also affected personal appearance. In some cities, certain trades had to wear specific clothing while on the job, not for safety, but for identification. Tanners might be required to wear brown aprons, blacksmiths had to wear wool caps, and barbers had to hang a striped cloth outside their shops. This cloth, often red and white, is the origin of the modern barber pole. If you failed to wear your guild-approved garb or set out your sign, you could be accused of working illegally or trying to steal clients from other members. The visual language of work was a form of law in itself. Apprenticeship laws were even more detailed. Some guilds restricted how many hours an apprentice could work, how often they could eat, and even who they could speak to while in training. If an apprentice was caught talking to a member of a rival guild, say, a tailor's apprentice chatting with a shoemaker, they might be accused of learning secrets, or betraying their trade. In some cases, a fine would be issued to the apprentice's master for negligent supervision. Workplace disputes were settled not by modern human resources departments, but by guild courts, often held weekly in town halls or local taverns. These courts had their own legal traditions, their own jargon, and sometimes their own rituals of resolution. In one tradition, two quarreling apprentices had to sit on either end of a shared bench, drink from the same mug, and recite the guild's founding oath in unison. If they refused, they were suspended from training for a week and had to sweep the entire workshop before being reinstated. Peace was not just encouraged, it was enforced. What makes all of these strange laws so fascinating is that they weren't necessarily intended to be cruel or controlling. Rather, they were designed to protect balance, fairness, and identity in a world where chaos was always close at hand. These laws helped maintain standards, prevent disputes, and ensure that everyone knew their place in the social and economic puzzle of the medieval world. The rules may have been strange, even amusing, but they reflected a deeply held belief in structure, tradition, and community responsibility. As you settle in and allow your thoughts to drift, imagine a narrow cobbled street lined with workshops and stalls. The scent of fresh bread and hot iron fills the air. A boy in a leather apron hurries to sweep the stoop before his master notices. A tailor tightens his measuring tape, while across the street, a brewer frowns at the foam on his ale. Overhead, a bell rings, signaling the hour, and a scribe walks through the square holding a parchment roll, the day's guild laws. And all around, people work quietly, carefully, following rules written not just in ink, but in the rhythms of their ancestors. In medieval Europe, love and marriage were rarely just about affection or personal choice. In fact, they were often governed by a complex network of customs, contracts, and legal restrictions that seemed baffling to modern eyes. Who you could marry, how you were allowed to court them, and even the ways you could express your intentions were all subject to local laws, religious rulings, and community expectations. Marriage was viewed not only as a spiritual union but also as a legal agreement and a means of preserving social order. And with that seriousness came a long list of strange, specific, and sometimes humorous rules designed to ensure that people behaved properly, or at least predictably, in matters of the heart. To begin with, marriage laws varied dramatically across regions and classes. In many parts of Europe, particularly in rural areas, a couple could be considered legally married without ever stepping foot in a church. If a man and a woman declared their intent to marry in front of witnesses and exchanged vows, a practice known as hand-fasting, the union could be recognized as binding under local custom. In some towns, even a verbal promise, if made sincerely and in the future tense, "I will marry you," was enough to trigger legal consequences. A man who later broke such a promise could be brought before the local court and forced to pay damages to the woman's family, or in some cases, ordered to marry her on the spot. One of the strangest features of medieval marriage law was the concept of consent. Unlike modern systems that often require official paperwork and formal ceremonies, medieval law centered on whether both parties had truly consented, and whether that consent had been expressed properly. But what counted as proper consent? The rules were complicated. Consent had to be freely given, not coerced, but it also had to be public enough to prevent secret or deceitful unions. Some communities even had bans, public announcements made in church 3 weeks in a row, to allow time for objections. If no one protested during that period, the couple was considered clear to marry. However, things became even stranger when it came to who could marry whom. In many places, there were strict rules about marrying within your social class, profession, or even neighborhood. A merchant's daughter might be forbidden by her family from marrying a poor craftsman, even if she wanted to. In some towns, guilds had rules prohibiting their members from marrying outsiders. A blacksmith might be legally obligated to marry within the smithing community, or risk being expelled from his guild, cutting off his livelihood entirely. More curiously, laws about kinship and bloodlines were taken extremely seriously, even when the connections were distant. Under canon law, people were not supposed to marry anyone within 7 degrees of consanguinity, a calculation based on shared ancestors. The method for calculating these degrees was so complicated that many couples had to consult church officials to find out if their match was legally allowed. In some cases, marriages were annulled after the fact when it was discovered that the bride and groom were 3rd or 4th cousins. Even spiritual relationships could count. If 2 people shared a godparent, their marriage could be forbidden. When it came to courtship, medieval law was just as peculiar. In many places, young people were not allowed to meet alone unless they were already engaged. Courting often took place in public areas, churchyards, markets, or village greens, with family members nearby. A man might demonstrate his interest by offering a gift, but laws sometimes dictated what kind of gifts were acceptable. A ring or brooch was considered a sign of serious intent, while food, ribbons, or trinkets were seen as casual. In some towns, giving a girl a valuable item and then failing to follow through with a proposal could result in legal action, with the suitor accused of leading her on. One of the most bizarre courtship customs came from parts of Scandinavia, where a suitor might be required to demonstrate his worth by performing labor for the woman's family. This could include chopping wood, building a fence, or helping with harvest. Refusal to complete the task could be interpreted as a lack of seriousness, and in rare cases, might be written into a marriage contract. The family of the bride-to-be would evaluate the man not just on his appearance or charm, but on his willingness to sweat for her affection. In other regions, legal documents called marriage contracts were drawn up even before engagement. These contracts were often negotiated by parents or guardians and could include details about dowries, property rights, and future children. If the groom backed out after signing, he might be fined or forced to return any gifts or property. If the bride's family failed to provide a promised dowry, the groom could annul the marriage altogether. These contracts weren't just practical, they were enforceable in court. In fact, marriage disputes were one of the most common types of civil cases in medieval town records. Even the wedding ceremony itself could fall under unusual legal rules. In some places, weddings had to be conducted outdoors, in front of the church, to ensure visibility and prevent secret unions. The couple would stand on the steps or in the churchyard while the priest read the vows. Only after the legal part was done would the couple go inside for the religious blessing. The idea was that the community had a right to see and hear the vows, to make the marriage valid in both a legal and social sense. Laws also governed behavior during the wedding. In certain regions of Germany and England, laws required that the bride and groom publicly kiss at the end of the ceremony to seal the contract, and if they refused, the wedding could be declared invalid. In some towns, the guests were expected to throw grain or bread at the couple, symbolizing fertility and abundance. Failing to complete this tradition could lead to a fine for the groom or a scolding from the priest. While many of these customs had roots in folklore or religion, they were enforced with the weight of law, reminders that marriage was everyone's business. After the wedding, there were even stranger traditions to follow. In parts of France, a newlywed couple could not be considered fully married until they completed the wedding ceremony, during which friends or family would escort the couple to their chamber with music, laughter, and sometimes even songs of advice. Though this ceremony was more symbolic than legal, in some towns, failure to perform it properly could lead to challenges against the marriage's validity, especially if property or inheritance was involved. Married life, too, came with its share of legal expectations. Husbands were expected to provide shelter, food, and clothing. Wives, depending on local customs, were expected to manage the household, assist with the husband's trade, or produce heirs. In some towns, if a wife was found to be too loud or quarrelsome, her husband could bring a complaint to the local court. The court might issue a warning or suggest counseling from a priest. In extreme cases, a woman could be sentenced to wear a scold's bridle, a humiliating iron muzzle, although this punishment was controversial and not universally accepted. In contrast, women had some surprising rights under marriage law. In many areas, a wife could bring a case against her husband for neglect, abuse, or abandonment, and in some cities, women were allowed to run shops, inherit land, or sign contracts, even while married. However, these rights were always subject to interpretation and often depended on the woman's social rank and the attitude of local judges or clergy. What is clear is that marriage was both a deeply personal and a deeply public institution, one bound tightly with law, ritual, and tradition. Strangely enough, there were even laws about remarriage and widowhood. A widow who remarried too quickly could face public shaming or accusations of greed. In some places, she was expected to wear mourning black for a full year before entering a new union. If she didn't, the second marriage might be considered suspicious, or even invalid. Widowers, on the other hand, faced fewer restrictions, but could still be fined if they remarried before certain church-sanctioned periods had passed. There were even superstitions written into local codes warning that quick remarriage could bring bad luck to the household or dishonor to the family. All of these laws and customs remind us that in medieval Europe, marriage was never just a private matter. It was a civic event, a legal contract, a religious ritual, and a public performance, all rolled into one. And with so many roles to play and so much at stake, it's no wonder that strange and sometimes contradictory laws emerge to guide it all. As you let your thoughts drift now, picture a quiet medieval village preparing for a wedding. Banners are raised over the streets. The baker pulls loaves from his oven. A priest practices the vows while the local scribe reviews a stack of contracts. Somewhere, a young man nervously smooths his tunic and adjusts the flower pin to his sleeve. He glances at the church steps, wondering not just whether she'll say yes, but whether all the rules, spoken and unspoken, will be satisfied. The village watches. The law listens. And history, as always, records it all. In the bustling streets, winding alleys, and countryside farms of medieval Europe, animals were not simply companions or food sources. They were essential co-workers, relied upon for transportation, labor, and survival. But beyond their roles in daily life, there were times when animals were treated almost like citizens of the community. They had jobs, expectations, and occasionally, legal obligations. In some rare but fascinating cases, they were even held accountable for their behavior in courts of law. To us, this might seem absurd, but to medieval people, animals weren't just dumb beasts. They were part of the moral and legal fabric of the world. Let's begin with the most familiar working animals of the Middle Ages: horses and oxen. These animals were indispensable. Oxen pulled plows through heavy soil, ensuring food could be grown. Horses carried knights into battle, hauled goods to market, and helped people travel from village to village. Because of their central role in daily survival, animals like these were often protected by local laws. In some towns, it was illegal to overwork your ox or to force your horse to carry a load beyond a certain weight. Breaking this law could lead to fines, or in extreme cases, the animal being taken away by authorities and given to a more deserving owner. In monasteries, animals were often integrated into spiritual routines. Monks might rely on donkeys to carry goods between abbeys or haul stones for construction. In return, some animals were given their own feeding schedules, stalls with names carved into them, or even burial spots on monastery grounds. While the animals themselves didn't understand their sacred status, the humans certainly did. There are records of monks praying for their animals and even writing short memorial verses when a donkey or dog passed away, a reminder of the emotional bond forged through shared labor. In cities, animals like dogs and cats played roles too, mostly as pest control. Cats were valued for keeping grain stores free from rats, and dogs were often used to guard homes and marketplaces. In some towns, it was illegal to kill a cat without cause, because they were considered essential to public hygiene and food security. One city ordinance in France even offered a small tax incentive to bakers who kept cats on the premises, not because the cats were cute, but because they protected the flour from rodents. Stranger still were the trained animals that held very specific jobs. In parts of Italy and Germany, goats and geese were sometimes used as guards. Geese, known for their sharp eyesight and loud honking, were placed outside gates or barns to alert farmers of intruders. If a goose failed to alert the household during a robbery, a rare but reported occurrence, the owner might bring the animal before local elders in a kind of symbolic hearing. While no one expected a goose to defend itself, the event helped reinforce the seriousness of loss and the emotional attachment between owner and animal. But not all working animals were large or loud. Some were tiny, and oddly trusted with remarkable tasks. In medieval mining towns, canaries were kept in cages to detect dangerous gases underground. Though the use of canaries is more commonly associated with the industrial age, the practice of using animals to signal environmental dangers began earlier than many think. In some texts from Eastern Europe, trained ferrets or small dogs were said to help miners detect changes in airflow or cave-ins. These animals were sometimes blessed by priests before beginning their duties, a strange but telling example of how animal labor was woven into the sacred rhythms of medieval life. Where things become even more curious is when animals broke the rules, or were perceived to. There are numerous records of animals being punished, not just in the dramatic trials described in earlier chapters, but in more mundane and occupational settings. For instance, in one Swiss village, a donkey that kicked over a grain cart and caused an injury was sentenced to a week of isolation in a pen outside town. This wasn't just symbolic. The isolation served as a kind of quarantine, both to prevent further accidents and to signal the seriousness of negligence, even if the donkey wasn't truly to blame. In parts of England, it was not uncommon for a working dog that bit someone while on duty to be muzzled permanently or even banished from town limits. This wasn't considered cruelty. It was viewed as a public safety measure. Likewise, a horse that spooked too often during transport or caused disruptions in the market might be banned from city roads or labeled as unfit for service by local officials. The owner would then have to sell the animal outside the town or retrain it entirely. In effect, the animals were given reputations, and those reputations followed them. Legal texts from medieval France and Flanders occasionally mention cases where disputes arose over the theft of trained animals, particularly those with specific skills. If the dog was trained to herd sheep or a falcon was trained to hunt, stealing that animal was treated more seriously than stealing a regular one. The logic was that the training, not just the animal, had value. Courts would assess damages not only based on the animal's species and age, but also on its skill set. In one case, a stolen falcon was described in court documents as more valuable than a horse, due to its ability to catch game for its noble owner. Interestingly, some laws extended animal protection into moral and even spiritual realms. In Brittany, legends speak of oxen being blessed before harvest season to protect them from illness or misfortune. In some villages, certain animals were not allowed to work during holy days, even if their human owners were exempt. Driving an ox cart on a feast day could result in a fine, not because the human was working, but because the animal was. It was as if the sacred nature of the day extended to all creatures, great and small. In monasteries, the relationship between monks and their working animals was even codified in rules. In the famous rule of Saint Benedict, kindness to animals was not only encouraged, it was required. Monks were told to feed animals before themselves, to treat them gently, and to avoid cruelty. If an animal acted up during a task, the appropriate response was prayer and patience, not punishment. These spiritual guidelines were not law in the civil sense, but in religious communities, they carried just as much weight, and often shaped local laws around animal welfare. There are even a few rare records of animals being rewarded for their service. In one town, a dog that saved a child from drowning was given a piece of land, which was actually claimed in the name of its owner but granted as recognition of the animal's deed. In other cases, animals who served loyally until old age, like church dogs or delivery horses, were retired with symbolic honors. A parish in Germany recorded a funeral mass for a donkey that had served the monastery for 20 years. Whether the mass was sincere or simply ceremonial, it shows how deeply animals were woven into the moral landscape of daily life. Perhaps one of the strangest roles an animal could play in medieval Europe was that of legal witness, not in the modern sense, but as part of rituals that required animal presence to seal oaths or settle disputes. In parts of rural England, a person swearing an oath of innocence might be required to do so while holding a rooster or standing beside an ox, the idea being that the animal's presence added sincerity or divine weight to the moment. There were even cases where a disputed land boundary was walked with a goat or sheep, which symbolized the ancient use of livestock to mark territory. The laws surrounding animals in medieval Europe were not entirely consistent. Some regions treated animals as property, pure and simple. Others acknowledged their labor, their training, and even their personalities. But across the continent, one truth remained: animals were not invisible. They were visible, valuable participants in the daily life of towns, villages, and religious institutions. And sometimes they were held to a standard of behavior as high, or higher, than their human handlers. As you close your eyes and drift toward rest, picture a narrow village lane at dawn. A boy leads an ox toward the field, nodding to the baker who's just opened his shutters. A goose honks from its perch beside the well. A shaggy dog trots ahead tail high, already on its daily patrol. And somewhere nearby, an elder scribes a note in the town ledger, not about taxes or grain, but about a mule that pulled more than its share, and a fine to be forgiven. It's a world where animals had roles, stories, even responsibilities. And tonight their quiet footsteps follow you into sleep. In the quiet corners of medieval villages, beyond the town square and just past the last lantern, there lingered a world of fear and fascination, a world not ruled by kings or priests, but by belief. The Middle Ages were steeped in the supernatural, and the line between law and magic was often thin and easily crossed. When suspicion stirred, when answers could not be found through reason or testimony, people sometimes turned to unusual rituals, mystical logic, and peculiar legal customs to determine guilt or innocence. These weren't just folklore or superstition. Many were formal parts of local law, accepted as serious methods for discovering the truth. Some of the most curious legal practices from this world involved what we might call tests of the unseen. These were procedures designed to uncover hidden guilt, prove innocence, or reveal secret wrongdoing through physical sensation, symbolic ritual, or divine signs. They might involve touching a sacred object, drinking a special mixture, or observing strange reactions during ceremonies. To us, they sound theatrical or even whimsical, but to those who used them, they were often the only way to confront things that couldn't be explained by logic alone. One of the best-known examples was the touch test, used especially in cases of theft or mysterious illness. In this ritual, a person suspected of causing harm through witchcraft or spiritual wrongdoing was brought before the afflicted person. If the victim experienced a seizure, sudden chill, or other unexplained reaction when the accused touched them, it was seen as evidence of guilt. These trials weren't always conducted by the church or the courts. They might be organized by local elders or even family members. In rural areas, such tests were treated with solemn seriousness. A farmer might swear by them more than by any official court process. An even stranger method was known as the bread test, or trial of the blessed morsel. In this ceremony, an accused person, often someone suspected of lying, was required to eat a small piece of bread or cake, sometimes blessed by a priest. If they could eat it without choking, coughing, or showing discomfort, they were declared innocent. But if they gagged, turned pale, or dropped the bread, it was believed that divine judgment had revealed the truth. This test was used in both civil and religious courts, especially in cases where evidence was lacking and testimony contradicted. It reflected a belief that the body itself would betray a guilty soul, that truth could be tasted. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, there was a custom called lifting the cauldron. When two people were locked in a dispute, often over property or inheritance, a heavy iron pot would be placed on the ground. Each person took turns trying to lift it. The belief was that the person who had lied or cheated would either fail to lift it or injure themselves while doing so. Sometimes the pot was filled with stones or sealed with wax to make it especially difficult. The outcome was seen as a divine sign, and local elders would often accept it as legally binding. It wasn't about strength, it was about purity of intention. Even stranger was the trial by reflection, an old ritual practiced in pockets of Eastern Europe. In this method, a basin of still water was placed under a bright light source, a candle, a window, or a fire. The accused was asked to gaze into the water while a question was asked aloud. If their reflection wavered, or if they hesitated to look, it was taken as evidence of a hidden lie. The idea was that the soul would disturb the water if guilt was present, an echo of older beliefs that water could reflect not just the face, but the truth of the heart. These trials might seem charming in their quaintness, but they were no laughing matter. A failed trial, no matter how small the ritual, could ruin reputations, end marriages, or even lead to exile. And although the methods varied, the logic remained consistent. Unseen forces were always watching, always listening, and always ready to reveal the truth if summoned properly. One of the more widely used legal customs in cases involving the supernatural was the ordeal of the key. This ritual was employed when someone was accused of hiding stolen goods or spreading rumors. A large iron key would be placed on a Bible or holy book, and the accused would be required to swear an oath while balancing the book in their hands. If they dropped the book or trembled while speaking, it was seen as a sign of guilt. In some towns, the key would be suspended from a thread and spun in a circle over a list of suspects. When the spinning stopped, the person it pointed to was called forth for questioning. Perhaps one of the most symbolic supernatural customs was the teacup test, though this name is modern. In truth, the ritual involved drinking a special herbal concoction made by a local healer or midwife. If a person was thought to be possessed, cursed, or haunted, they would be asked to drink this tea while reciting prayers. The herbs, usually calming or bitter, might cause a strong physical reaction, such as sweating or nausea. The idea was not to poison or punish, but to purify. If the person reacted too violently, it was taken as a sign that something dark remained inside them. If they remained calm, it meant the spirit or influence had passed. In many communities, this was both a legal and spiritual right. In regions where witchcraft was feared, laws against maleficium, or harmful magic, led to a variety of odd legal procedures. Some involved searching the accused for witch marks, small blemishes or moles believed to be signs of pacts with dark forces. In some towns, officials carried small silver needles to test whether these marks bled when pricked. If they didn't, or if the person didn't react, it was considered suspicious. Other laws involved searching the home of the accused for unusual objects, dolls, cords tied in knots, animal bones, or jars of herbs. Possessing too many strange items could lead to charges, even if no harm had been done. Even marriage was not immune from supernatural laws. In some places, couples were required to drink from the same cup during their wedding to prove their union was blessed. If the cup broke, or if either person hesitated to drink, it was seen as a bad omen, and in rare cases, might even void the ceremony. Similarly, if a new bride's animals refused to eat for 3 days after her arrival, some communities viewed it as a spiritual sign that something was wrong in the home, prompting interventions by priests or elders. The fear of unseen forces also influenced inheritance laws. In some parts of France and Germany, when a person died and left behind a contested will, their possessions might be placed in a circle of stones while the heirs stood around it and recited oaths. If anyone refused, or if birds or animals crossed the circle during the ritual, it was interpreted as a spiritual rejection of the inheritance. Legal documents sometimes record such moments as reasons for disqualifying claims, a blending of legal procedure and folk tradition. It's important to understand that these strange supernatural trials weren't random acts of panic. They were rooted in a worldview that saw the spiritual and the legal as deeply connected. Justice wasn't just about facts, it was about balance, truth, and harmony with the unseen. If someone upset that balance, even without proof, the community needed a way to respond. These rituals, odd as they were, helped people feel they had restored order. Over time, many of these laws and customs faded away, especially with the rise of centralized courts and more rational legal systems. But echoes of them remain, in folklore, in superstition, and in the quiet ways people still sometimes look for meaning beyond what they can see. As your thoughts begin to float like candlelight on still water, imagine standing in a stone chapel lit by a single flame. An elder opens a book, a feather rests nearby, and the room is hushed. You are asked to place your hand on the book and speak, not just to those around you, but to something older, something listening. A ritual is performed, not to punish, but to understand. And outside, the wind stirs, carrying the old ways gently into the night. While much of medieval law focused on crime, trade, marriage, or morality, there was another category of legislation that was stranger still: laws that tried to control how people had fun. Entertainment, leisure, and celebration might seem like harmless aspects of life, but in many medieval towns, festivals, jokes, games, and even dancing were tightly regulated. Joy, like work or worship, had its limits. And when merriment stepped outside those limits, it could trigger fines, bans, or even public punishment. These laws weren't always about stopping fun. Often, they were about protecting order, preserving morality, or guarding tradition. But the ways in which they were written and enforced reveal a lot about what medieval society valued and feared when people gathered to laugh, cheer, or play. Let's begin with laughter itself, which might seem like the last thing anyone would want to legislate. Yet there are records of laws in both religious and civic contexts that sought to limit excessive laughter, particularly in solemn spaces. In monasteries, strict rules were written into codes like the Rule of Saint Benedict, instructing monks to avoid loud laughter or foolish jesting. The idea was not to eliminate joy, but to cultivate discipline. Monks could smile or laugh quietly in moments of permitted recreation, but laughter during prayers, meals, or scripture reading was forbidden. Violators could be made to fast, clean the chapel, or sit apart from others during meals as a quiet form of correction. This emphasis on measured laughter also extended to church services and public gatherings during holy days. In many towns, it was illegal to tell jokes, sing playful songs, or engage in theatrical performances within church walls or directly outside them, especially during Lent or on saints' feast days. A singer who performed a comical song too close to a church door might be fined for disrespect. A dancer caught near a shrine could be banned from festivals for a season. Even clowns and jesters, who were typically beloved, were told to avoid sacred hours, or risk being driven out of town. When it came to festivals, laws were often even more detailed, and sometimes bizarre. While towns eagerly looked forward to events like Carnival, Easter fairs, or midsummer celebrations, local councils often issued pages of regulations outlining how and when people could celebrate. In one town in northern France, a law limited the number of people allowed to wear masks during Carnival to no more than 30 at once, supposedly to prevent confusion and the loss of identity. Another town in Italy banned all costumes that made participants look like clergy, citing repeated cases of mock sermons that made fun of local priests. In parts of Germany and England, dancing laws were particularly strange. In one case, a town prohibited dancing in a straight line through the streets during spring festivals, claiming it disrupted traffic and caused complaints from shopkeepers. In another, dancing was only allowed if accompanied by a sanctioned drumbeat. No flutes, no bells, no impromptu tambourines. The logic was that structured dancing brought people together, but chaotic dancing risked disorder, noise, and sometimes even fights. A tavern owner might be fined if a spontaneous jig broke out and wasn't quickly calmed. Games, too, were heavily policed. Dice games and card games were particularly suspect in the eyes of many rulers. While playing for fun was tolerated, playing for money, or even for bread or wine, was often outlawed. In England, several monarchs passed laws forbidding commoners from playing games that were considered noble pastimes, such as chess or real tennis. The fear was that such games distracted workers, encouraged gambling, or made people forget their place in society. In one case from the 14th century, a merchant's apprentice was caught betting on a dice game behind his master's shop and sentenced to sweep the town's market square for a full week while wearing a sign that read, "Idler." Children's games were also sometimes targeted by local law. In certain towns, games that made too much noise, involved throwing stones, or chased animals through the streets were banned during specific hours, usually while church was in session or merchants were conducting business. In parts of Italy, boys caught playing King of the Hill on church steps could be made to recite psalms aloud as penance. In some cities, games were only permitted in certain public fields or alleyways, and children found running in the main square could be scolded by constables or even have their toys temporarily confiscated. And then there were the laws governing storytelling, singing, and performance, which might seem odd to regulate but were taken seriously by medieval authorities. Minstrels and bards were common figures at markets and festivals, but they had to obey specific rules. In parts of Spain, for instance, it was illegal for a traveling singer to perform without a license from the local guild or parish. Songs that included satire, insults, or political themes were forbidden, especially if they mocked nobility or town officials. In some cases, the singer was required to submit the lyrics of their songs in writing to be approved by a magistrate before performing. One particularly odd rule from a city in the Low Countries required that any performer who used animals in their act must guarantee that the animals would not speak, dance, or mimic clergy. This was less about belief in talking animals and more about controlling satire. The fear was that a juggler might dress a goat in priestly robes or teach a bird to say mocking phrases, something that could easily upset the town's religious leaders. There were also laws around festival food, which may not sound strange until you consider the details. In one English village, it was forbidden to sell mead or ale stronger than a certain proof during May Day festivals, for fear that intoxicated dancers might fall into fountains or start brawls. In a French town, festival bakers were required by law to make laughing bread, loaves shaped like faces with wide smiles, but were fined if the smiles appeared lewd or unholy. These loaves were seen as symbols of communal joy, but only within tightly defined boundaries. Too much fun, it seemed, could cross a legal line. One of the most curious festival laws comes from medieval Nuremberg, where a spring celebration called the Feast of the Tailors allowed members of the Tailors Guild to put on a pageant with costumes and a mock parade. But the law specified that no member could wear a hat taller than 12 inches or a tunic longer than his knees. The idea was that tailors, known for flamboyant fashion, might use the parade to show off or outshine nobles. So, even in their moment of fun, they were legally reined in. Across Europe, many festivals included mock trials, feast kings, or lords of misrule, figures appointed to overturn the normal order for a day or two. But even these topsy-turvy traditions came with rules. In England, a law stated that a lord of misrule could not enter a church during his reign or attempt to bless food, both of which were seen as mocking sacred practices. In France, the Feast of Fools was similarly regulated, with participants forbidden from using church bells or wearing bishop's robes unless granted permission by a council. All of these examples might sound restrictive, but in many cases, the laws were about channeling energy, not destroying it. Medieval authorities understood that festivals were essential for community morale, spiritual reflection, and seasonal celebration. But they also worried about what might happen if laughter went too far, if dancing turned into disorder, or if games became disruptive. So, they created strange laws, some strict, some silly, to keep things within bounds. As you drift into stillness now, imagine a medieval village lit by lanterns, music echoing across the square. A dancer twirls in a circle, careful not to break the rhythm set by the drummer. Children toss wooden rings onto painted pegs, and a baker places a tray of smiling loaves in his window. A jester bows, but doesn't cross the churchyard line. And everywhere, joy glows, not wild and lawless, but shaped by tradition, framed by custom, and carried carefully into the evening air. In the minds of medieval people, land was more than just soil underfoot. It was status, security, and survival. Owning a field, a garden, or even a tiny strip of pasture gave a person identity and purpose. But with land came boundaries. And with boundaries came arguments. And with arguments came an entire category of highly specific, sometimes baffling laws meant to determine who owned what, who could step where, and even who was allowed to eat which fruit. From fence disputes to Berry rights, medieval Europe saw property law taken to astonishing and occasionally hilarious extremes, all in the name of keeping peace between neighbors. Let's begin with the fence, one of the most disputed objects in medieval village life. A fence could separate not only two plots of land but also two families, two generations, or two social classes. In many places, fences were considered communal responsibilities, even when they sat between private lands. If your cow broke through the fence and wandered into your neighbor's field, you could be fined, not because of the cow's curiosity, but because your section of the fence wasn't strong enough. Local laws frequently required that every landowner build and maintain the portion of the fence that bordered their neighbor's property. If a fence rotted, fell over, or had gaps large enough for an animal to pass through, the owner was legally obligated to repair it within a set number of days, often 3 or 7, depending on the region. In one particularly detailed set of ordinances from 14th century Flanders, the law specified that fences must be made of upright wooden stakes no more than a man's knee apart, each bound with 2 bands of willow or iron. The height of the fence was even regulated: too low, and it was a hazard; too high, and it cast shade on the neighbor's crops. Disputes over fence height were common in cities as well as rural areas. In London, where narrow alleys separated homes, laws dictated exactly how high a wall or partition could be between neighbors. A wall that blocked too much light could lead to a lawsuit, and in some cases, the owner was ordered to knock it down and start over. There were even rules about fence shadows. If the shadow of your fence stretched too far into another person's garden and affected their plants, you could be summoned to a fence court to defend your design choices. And then there was the curious matter of hedge law. In regions where wooden fences were scarce or too expensive, people built living fences, hedges, made from hawthorn, blackthorn, or other thorny shrubs. These hedges served the same function as fences but came with their own set of rules. In parts of England, a person was required to trim their hedge twice a year, with the trimmings left in place for neighbors to inspect. If a hedge grew too wide or blocked a path, the owner could be fined or ordered to have it thin to the elbow, meaning no thicker than the width of a man's bent arm. One of the strangest legal customs related to land was the Beating of the bounds. This was a yearly ritual where townspeople, led by priests and elders, would walk the boundaries of their village, reciting prayers and striking the ground with sticks or rods. The goal was to remember the exact borders of the town, especially in an age before detailed maps. In some versions of the ritual, young boys were carried upside down or even whipped lightly at boundary markers so they would remember the spot forever. This strange blend of ceremony, memory, and physical reinforcement was part of how medieval people kept property disputes to a minimum. But despite all this attention to fences and borders, disputes still arose. And many of them revolved not around soil, but around trees, particularly fruit-bearing ones. Fruit, after all, was seasonal, desirable, and easy to steal. In nearly every medieval region, there were laws about who could pick fruit, when they could pick it, and how much they could take. A cherry tree that grew beside a property line could cause years of tension. Was it yours if it grew from your soil? Or your neighbor's if its branches stretched over their side of the fence? In many areas, the law said that anything growing on your land belonged to you, unless it crossed the boundary. Fruit that hung over a fence into someone else's space was often considered fair game for the neighbor. But picking it required care. In parts of France and Germany, there were rules that allowed you to take only what you could reach with your hand while standing on your own property. Using a stick, a ladder, or climbing the tree was forbidden unless you had the tree owner's permission. A person caught shaking a neighbor's tree from their own side could be fined, not for stealing the fruit, but for disturbing the roots and soil with unnecessary violence. Then there were laws about fallen fruit. In many villages, fruit that fell from a tree onto someone else's land still belonged to the tree's owner. But fruit that fell into a public road was considered common property, and anyone could collect it. One particularly detailed ordinance from a town in Italy stated that a person who found more than 3 figs or 2 apples on the road must split them with the nearest neighbor, or else be considered greedy and subject to a tax. The exact numbers varied by region, but the principle remained: fruit was not to be hoarded, and its movement across property lines was to be watched closely. In orchard-heavy regions like Provence or the Rhine Valley, fruit laws extended to harvesting seasons. Local councils declared official fruit-picking days, during which everyone was allowed to gather fruit from public trees or neglected orchards. These days were often festive occasions, with musicians, bread sellers, and children running among the trees. But outside of these permitted windows, picking fruit from public trees could lead to fines, or even a night in the town jail. Harvest timing was serious business, and interfering with it was seen as a disruption to both economic fairness and seasonal order. Perhaps the most charmingly odd category of medieval property law dealt with pathways, shortcuts, and secret passages. Many medieval towns were tightly packed, with winding alleys and shared courtyards. It was common for people to cut through neighbors' yards or gardens on the way to church, market, or the well. At first, these shortcuts were tolerated, especially if the user asked politely. But over time, repeated use could be interpreted as a legal claim of passage. This led to strange laws designed to stop shortcuts from becoming rights of way. In parts of England and the Low Countries, there were rules that stated if a neighbor crossed your property without permission for more than a year and a day, they could claim permanent access. To prevent this, homeowners sometimes built temporary fences, placed thorny branches across paths, or even dug shallow trenches to stop repeated passage. In some towns, it was required by law that if you didn't want someone walking across your land, you had to shout at them clearly and audibly at least once a season. If you failed to protest, it was assumed you had no objection, and the law would take the neighbor's side. Even wells and water rights were governed by oddly specific laws. In dry regions, a shared well might be owned jointly by 4 or 5 families. Each was allowed to draw a certain number of buckets per day, and exceeding that number could lead to penalties. In times of drought, towns implemented water rationing ordinances that assigned specific hours to specific households, a kind of time slot system enforced by a bell or town crier. Anyone caught drawing water outside their assigned hour might be shamed or reported to the bailiff. And what about buildings themselves? Medieval towns often grew in haphazard fashion, with homes added onto over the years in strange angles and curious shapes. As a result, there were laws that governed how much your roof could overhang your neighbor's land, how far your gutters could extend, and whether or not your windows could look into someone else's yard. These were known as laws of projection and privacy, and breaking them could result in the medieval equivalent of a zoning violation. In some places, a window that opened directly toward a neighbor's garden had to be fitted with a wooden shutter or lattice to prevent spying. In others, building too close to a neighbor's door without a courtesy space, often 3 paces wide, could result in a fine. A family caught expanding their kitchen wall without permission might be ordered to remove the stones one by one and return them to the quarry. These weren't just personal disputes. They were matters of public record, often resolved by councils or elders who took land boundaries as seriously as royal decrees. As your thoughts begin to settle, imagine a peaceful village where the fences are all standing straight, the hedges trimmed to elbow width, and the apple trees heavy with fruit that waits patiently for its picking day. A boy walks past the boundary stone, careful not to step too close to the neighbor's barley. A woman leans over her wall to inspect her plum branches, watching to see if any have strayed too far. The wind rustles the leaves, carrying the scent of figs and warm soil. And somewhere nearby, a scribe notes it all in quiet script. Another day of peace maintained by rules as strange as they are sacred. Rest now. The gates are locked, the shadows fall neatly within their assigned lines, and the fruit waits sweetly on the branch. All is in order, at least for tonight. Travel in the Middle Ages was rarely simple. There were no highway maps, no GPS, no rental cars or credit cards. Journeys were long, exhausting, and sometimes dangerous. Roads were often little more than rutted paths through muddy forests, or winding trails between windswept fields. And while travel could bring freedom or opportunity, it could also bring suspicion, especially if you were a stranger arriving in a town where no one knew your name. For these reasons and more, medieval Europe developed a wide range of unusual laws surrounding travel, tolls, road use, and the rules for how outsiders were to be treated. Some of these laws were practical. Others were based on superstition, fear, or the desire to maintain local control. But all of them, in one way or another, shaped how people moved through the world. Let's begin with the basics, the roads themselves. In many parts of Europe, roads were maintained not by the state, but by local communities, landowners, or monasteries. Each town or estate was responsible for a section of road, and the quality of that road often reflected the wealth, or priorities, of its caretakers. To ensure that roads were usable, towns often passed laws requiring annual maintenance, especially after heavy rains or during spring thaw. Every household might be ordered to contribute labor, wood, or stones to roadwork. In one village in England, a law stated that each able man must offer 2 days yearly with spade or cart to the good of the road, or else pay a fine of 1 shilling. Beyond local roads, there were travel routes subject to tolls, and these tolls were among the most detailed and peculiar fees in medieval law. Known as passage rights or road duties, these tolls varied widely. In some regions, a toll keeper would charge a flat fee for each traveler. In others, the fee was based on what you were carrying. For example, in parts of Germany, travelers on foot paid less than those with carts. If your cart carried hay, the toll might be 1 coin. If it carried cheese, the toll could be doubled. If it carried barrels of wine, you might be stopped for questioning and charged based on how much the toll keeper thought you could afford. Some towns posted long wooden boards listing dozens of different toll amounts for horses, sheep, cloth, barrels, books, chickens, and more. Certain animals carried their own toll rates. A shepherd driving a flock of geese through a toll gate might be charged per dozen birds, while a merchant with a camel, yes, they were rare, but not unheard of, might be charged an exotic animal fee. In one town, donkeys loaded with bread were exempt from tolls during feast days, provided the bread was distributed freely at the church. These tolls weren't just economic tools. They were a way for communities to control who came and went, to discourage certain types of traffic, or to raise funds for local repairs. Sometimes the toll laws were shockingly specific. In the Low Countries, a canal town once passed an ordinance that any cartload of turnips entering the city on market day must be inspected by a broodweir at the gate. If the turnips were deemed soft, overlarge, or undersweet, the merchant had to pay a waste toll, a tax for bringing substandard produce into the city. In an English port town, a law stated that those who bring fish on carts through the East Gate must pay a fin tax, save for Wednesdays, when fish brought before the bell shall pass free. Local exceptions and quirky traditions created a patchwork of toll policies that travelers had to memorize or learn the hard way. But even before reaching the toll gate, travelers often faced restrictions on when and how they could journey. In many places, travel after sundown was discouraged or outright forbidden, especially for strangers. Some towns closed their gates at sunset and would not allow entry until morning. A traveler caught on the road after dark might be stopped by guards, questioned at length, or directed to a nearby inn or shrine for the night. The reasoning was partly for safety, but also for order. Darkness was associated with mischief, crime, and spirits, and keeping people off the roads at night helped keep suspicion at bay. To move safely between regions, travelers often carried travel letters or safe conduct papers. These documents, issued by lords, merchants, or religious authorities, served as proof that the traveler had legitimate business. A pilgrim might carry a letter from their local priest, a merchant from their guild master, or a scribe from a university. Without such documents, strangers could be treated with suspicion or barred from entering towns entirely. In some places, people caught without papers were made to stand at the town gate and explain themselves aloud to the public, a kind of improvised background check that let townspeople weigh in on whether the traveler should be trusted. If allowed to enter, a traveler might be required to register with local authorities, especially if they planned to stay more than a day. In certain regions of France and Germany, laws required all guests to report to the town bailiff within 24 hours and declare their name, purpose, and expected length of stay. In bustling market towns, innkeepers were held responsible for their guests' behavior, and were fined if a guest committed a crime, failed to pay, or overstayed their welcome. As a result, many innkeepers kept detailed ledgers, some of which survive to this day, offering a peek into the world of medieval comings and goings. Travelers weren't only monitored for reasons of law and order. They were also seen as potential carriers of disease, heresy, or unrest. During times of plague or social tension, entire regions would pass temporary travel bans, forbidding outsiders from entering or requiring them to undergo inspection before doing so. In one instance, a walled town in Italy declared that no stranger could enter without burning his boots, bathing in lime water, and reciting a prayer at the gate. Though such laws might not have been widely enforced, their presence in civic record shows how seriously communities took the risks of exposure, physical or spiritual. Some towns had odd hospitality laws, requiring certain households to host travelers on behalf of the town, known as hosting duties or quartering obligations. These laws meant that wealthier citizens might be ordered to give a visiting nobleman or official food and shelter for a night, without charging them. In return, the town council might exempt the hosts from certain taxes or give them public praise. While this practice had its roots in earlier feudal customs, it lingered in certain cities well into the late medieval period. One of the more unusual aspects of travel law involved the right of sanctuary. If a person was fleeing a crime, or simply seeking protection, they could sometimes claim temporary safety by entering a church, shrine, or sacred space. Once inside, they could not be forcibly removed for a certain period, often 40 days. During that time, local authorities might negotiate, investigate, or allow the accused to confess and accept exile instead of punishment. In some towns, laws required that the sanctuary seeker wear a specific color cloak or carry a wooden cross to signal their protected status while moving through town. Travel also raised questions about trade and market access. In many towns, there were laws stating that locals had priority in selling goods. A merchant from another region might be required to wait until local vendors had sold their wares before setting up shop. In some cases, foreign merchants had to pay extra to rent a stall or agree to sell only in designated zones, often on the edge of the marketplace. These rules aimed to protect local economies and were strictly enforced, often by market wardens who patrolled the area with staffs or scrolls of regulations. Despite all these rules, travelers found ways to adapt. Pilgrims wore recognizable badges. Merchants formed caravans for protection and support. Musicians, actors, and storytellers developed signals and greetings to show they posed no threat. And in many cases, the people they met were eager to hear their tales, trade goods, or offer shelter. Strangers might have been regulated, but they were also sources of news, novelty, and distant flavors, all of which brought a spark of the outside world to towns that sometimes felt enclosed by walls and worry. As your thoughts begin to drift and soften, imagine a moonlit road winding through a quiet valley. A man on foot approaches a wooden gate, travel letter in hand. A dog barks in the distance. The gatekeeper leans on his staff, listens, then nods. The door creaks open. The man enters, steps into a pool of lantern light, and begins his search for food, rest, and a place to lay his head. He has followed the rules, presented the right tokens, spoken the right words. And tonight, he will be allowed to stay. And so, dear listener, we gently close the pages of this curious chapter in time. We've wandered through dusty courtyards and crowded marketplaces, peeked over fences and past hedgerows, followed pilgrims and tradesmen, and listened in on laws that govern everything from laughter to livestock. Strange as they may seem, each law, each rule, was a reflection of a world trying to make sense of itself, a world shaped by tradition, belief, and the desire to live in peace, however imperfectly. Now, the noise of the festival has faded. The toll gates are locked. The ink has dried on the scrolls of parchment, and the magistrate has laid down his seal for the night. There are no more trials today. No more tolls to pay. Just the comfort of stillness, the soft memory of a time long past, and the gentle rhythm of your breath in the present. Let your mind rest where the strange becomes soothing, where the odd becomes ordinary, and where sleep waits, just beyond the edge of history. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.